Hello and good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. Welcome to our newest session for Engine 6 website training. My name is Kevin Robinson on the product team, and I know we have a few people that are still kind of jumping in from the morning registrations. So we're going to give it about 20-30 seconds here before we get started and launch into our content. As we're waiting for that, I'll just give you a quick tour for those of you that have not used GoToWebinar before. As we go throughout the session, everyone that is on the line will be muted. That's basically just to limit any chaos or any audio issues that we might have. So if you have questions during the process, feel free to drop those into the questions module that is on the GoToWebinar module itself on the bottom right-hand side. I'll try to get as many questions as I can during the actual session itself. If for some reason I don't get to your particular question, I'll definitely make sure to follow up with you after the session. And speaking of that, as we go through here, this will be recorded. So we will send a follow-up recording and email. You can also access all historical session recordings from dealersocket.com/engine6training. And we'll show you that URL here in just a second. So that's pretty much the logistics as far as the actual training session itself goes. I'm going to start out here with a very brief slideshow or PowerPoint deck just to give you the lay of the land and a little bit of an agenda. And then we'll actually jump into the Engine 6 tool itself. Now, one thing I will mention is as we go through this process, and if you have questions, we'll try to make this as high level as possible. Obviously, we're going to dive deep into some specific concepts and functionality, but we'll try and reserve all questions for the actual session itself. We won't be able to get into necessarily site-specific questions, but we'll have an email address at the end of the session if for any reason you have any questions on your particular website and need a little bit more product information. So let's go ahead and get started. As I said, my name is Kevin Robinson. I'm the product manager for DealerFire over the top of websites and digital marketing. I've been at DealerFire for about 7 years. I have overseen the Engine 6 product since its inception. So if you have any questions as we go along here, I can try and answer those not only from a product standpoint, but also from a consultation standpoint. If you have any questions on best practices or in particular how to use a specific tool, etc. So to do just a little bit of a debrief, here are the list of sessions that we currently have and have had in the past. So right now we're up to, obviously today is the 18th, which is customizing your website using global styles. And we've had basically 2 webinars every month since we started this training program. The first being more a intro or getting used to using Engine 6. You can find those recordings on this training page to watch any historical sessions. And then we have one deep dive session every month as well. As we get into January, we might dial back some of the initial onboarding sessions and go more track specific or deep dive because there's been a lot of requests for this type of information getting a little bit deeper into the tool. So we'll see how we can accommodate that. And as always, if you have any feedback, you can send it to the email address that I'm going to share with you, or you can definitely drop it into the questions module within GoToWebinar. So today's session, we're going to cover a few things. Obviously, the high-level concept is going to be managing global styles. I'll get into the tool here in just a little bit, but ultimately what I want you to think of in terms of global styles is the underlying architecture of your website. So obviously, your website is going to have a lot of architectural data, but in terms of styles, this would be things like your fonts, your colors, the way that specific CTAs or buttons display. And we'll not only drill into how those can be edited, but also how they can be edited across styles or across devices, I should say. So if you want a button to look a little bit different, or if you want a text weight to be a little bit different on a handheld device, for instance, that can all be updated using our current system. So 3 specific tracks or categories that we're going to dive into. The first being global styles management, where to access that within our CMS. Then we'll talk about adjusting website styles, colors, and fonts. Now, there is a little bit of a caveat here in terms of franchise dealerships. If you are a part of one of those lucky OEM programs that has certain restrictions on things like fonts and colors, not all of these things will be applicable to you. But I'll try and call attention to those as we go through. And then lastly, as I mentioned before, how do you work across multiple devices? Let's say for a specific call to action or button, you want it to be a little bit bigger on mobile as opposed to desktop. How do you make that device-specific adjustment? So we'll go through that as well. And then we'll try and leave about 5 minutes at the very end for just a general Q&A session. My hope is that this entire session itself will take approximately 30 minutes. There's no reason to really go above and beyond that unless there's a lot of questions. So we'll try and get you out here at the half hour, about 1:30 Central Time. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the tool now. And for most of you that have Engine 6, you're probably pretty familiar about accessing this. But just in case, we'll start from the top. If you're logging into the Ignite CMS or content management system, all you need to do is go to the very bottom, and there's this little toolkit icon, which is basically just Engine 6. So if I expand the toolbar here, the main navigation, you can see at the very bottom, this is how you're actually going to access your website builder or your website itself. Go ahead and collapse that. Obviously, you can access every single individual page, whether it be linked or unlinked from your menu manager. I typically just go to the home page to manage specific device styles or global styles, just because it's a little bit easier to see. But the biggest thing in this case is, like I had mentioned, your site architecture is the consistency across pages. So whereas with other platforms, you might be editing your CSS per page or your HTML per page, and you can end up with inconsistent styles like colors or text patterns, line breaks, things like that. You're actually managing your styles on a global basis with Engine 6, and that's just so every single page that you create, whether it's from a template or customized, built from scratch, will actually inherit those styles themselves. So let's go ahead and jump into it. First and foremost, you're going to be able to find the global styles, which I use interchangeably with design, in the primary navigation of your website builder, so at the very top. Once you click into your design tab, that's going to open up your global styles configuration. You can see it here, it just pops up on the right side of the page. This is where all of those styles, designs, fonts, etc. are actually managed. So if you have any questions on this as we're going through, feel free to drop those into the questions module. So as you can see here, we have about 7 different categories: colors, text, heading, buttons, forms, panels, overlays. A lot of them kind of inherit or adopt kind of the same flow or the same process, which is essentially what does a specific data set look like across all devices as well as across all your sites. I'll go into that here in just a second. You can see at the very top here, we have a kind of a caution banner, which is managing the styles across the entire website. These changes are made globally. However, many modules give you the option to override certain global styles with specific module styles. And that's one point that I want to make sure is perfectly clear. Whenever you're building a page and you're drag and dropping a module into place, similar to like a Squarespace style, there are certain instances where you'll actually have the ability to edit the module styles while it's on the page. So you're essentially overwriting it in that case, but still no code needed, no coding seen for miles. But all of those settings or configurations can be accessed within the module. And if we have enough time here at the end, I'll show an example of what that module style overwriting potentially looks like. So the other thing to keep in mind is, as you're going through this, you definitely might make some mistakes, right? The best way that I've kind of put this in order to test is definitely pull up your design tab. You can make some changes on the fly, but just don't save and publish the page. You can actually just refresh your browser and it'll close out any of those changes that you potentially had. So if you're creating a new homepage or a different custom landing page and you just kind of want to test how design styles are actually used, simply enough, just don't publish them. That's the easiest way to go about that. So you can still see the changes in real time within the visual editor, but they're actually not being published consumer facing on your website itself. So let's start first with colors themselves. Now, websites can be many different colors, obviously, as we've seen with different examples throughout the industry. But obviously, in terms of consistency across your website, you want to make sure things are inheriting the same color across every page. We don't want to have hot pink on one page, green on one page, blue on another page, yellow on another page. It just gets too sloppy. There's too much technical debt. It's not a good user experience for your customers or your consumers. So that's why we basically allow you to select primary colors and secondary colors. Now, the nice thing about Engine 6 is that not only do we have a color wheel that you can potentially choose from, but we also have hex values. So as I click into my primary color for hover, in this case, you can see at the very bottom, the hex value is actually just dropped into a field. This is a manual edit field. So if at your dealership you have design standards, or you're working in an OEM program where they have design standards like Volkswagen or Acura, for instance, those exact hex values can actually be dropped directly into the manual field. On the left-hand side, these are all of the suggested colors that we have for the site based on what your selection is. You can also use the color contrast square right here, which just allows you to essentially drag this little circle or magnifying glass to select whatever color you actually want to display. So that'll update in real time, as you can see here with our secondary colors. We can also edit transparency of a specific color. That's what this sliding scale is for. So for instance, if I want something to be more transparent, I'm just going to drag this scale and it'll still update that hex value. But as you can see with my primary calls to action here within Hover, it's made it semi-transparent as well. If I drag this to the very end, I go back to being a solid color. So standard color selections, hex values, as well as transparency options as well. So I'm going to go back to what our color was previously, just to make sure that we're in the right here. Then, as I go through my color lineup, as you can see, we have a primary color and a primary cover hover. We also have a secondary and secondary hover. So these will be changing in real time as you go throughout the website. But we also have the ability to edit specific elements on the website that are module based, like solid and dashed lines, solid boxes, and then structure, which is basically just container styles that we potentially have. So you can easily make a website and update. Let me open that back up. You can easily make a website and update the colors across all of your pages in real time. So all you have to do is save and publish from this point. The nice thing is if you're a content marketer or if you're working with DealerFire in your content marketing, every page that you've already created, let's say you have 100 to 150 different pages that are already on your website, once those get updated with global styles, it'll actually update all of those website pages at once. So you don't have to go in and manually update CSS or anything like that. It's a really nice, efficient system, especially if you're doing a lot of different website management. The second thing that we'll talk about is text families. So as most of you know, building a website, design is a really big component of what the customer-facing version of your digital brand is. And font is a huge portion of that. If anyone's seen Google's recent update that they did within GChat and their Gmail services, basically any Google My Business or apps segments, some of the fonts has been updated and it's really striking. If you go to an OEM website, they typically have their own proprietary font, even if it's something that's taken from like an Avenir or different type of font family like that. So font is a really nice way to kind of create some distinction for your website. And if you have a specific font that you are using, first and foremost, we integrate with Google Fonts. So we have about 200 or so different fonts that can actually be used on the website. We're adding a few more essentially every 2 weeks within our sprint cycles. But you also notice here, and keep in mind I'm an admin on this side, so I have some access to fonts that you wouldn't normally have access to. But you can see here we have things like Acura, Bespoke, Jaguar, Kia, Land Rover, Mazda. Due to ACL permissions, most of you that are on this call won't actually have access to the fonts. They'll actually be locked down, and that's just because permission-based, we need to make sure that we're in line with OEM compliance. For those of you that have a retail website with us outside of a OEM program, or those of you that are independent dealers, you can use any one of these fonts that you want. So as I go down the page here, for instance, if I wanted to use the cabin fonts as opposed to Able, which is what I'm using right now, when I update that for my primary font family, you can see in real time the visual editor will actually update that for me. So if I like the font, great. If I want to change it again to something maybe a little bit more distinct, like Meriwether, I can make that update as well. And that also goes for your heading font family. So if I have a H1 tag or an H2 tag, this can all be updated within my text specific section of styles. I won't get too deep into things like your font size and font color because I feel these things are pretty well edited within your heading, especially if you're using a paragraph module. So we'll get into that here in just a second. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. The heading family or the heading section is probably the most important. That's especially if you are doing any sort of content marketing or building any pages that have the paragraph module. And basically just to show you what that looks like, I'm going to go into let's go into a special offers page. I'm going to close out these changes. And if I were to drag a paragraph module onto the page, access that from my module gallery and drop it into place, you can see here within my WYSIWYG editor that I have the ability to actually select, should this be an H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, all the way down to H6. So I'm just going to put in dealer sockets, engine 6 training. And as I select this and change it to H1, you'll see that this is going to inherit the global style that's already set. So if I go back into my design, bring up my heading section, and go to my heading styles, here's my H1. It's currently set up at 39 pixels with about 20 pixels of margin on the top and 10 pixels of margin on the bottom. If I wanted to increase this, you can see in real time it's going to update within that paragraph widget or that paragraph module as well. Now, the cool thing about this is that it's all device specific. This is really where we're first getting into this conversation about managing the way our website looks across devices. So as you can see here, for instance, with my H1 under font size, I have it set at 50 pixels right now. And if I hover over this little icon, basically what this says is this is going to lock this H1 style for the device that I'm currently on. So for all desktop versions or categories of devices that are actually accessing my website, that H1 is always going to come in at 50 pixels, right? So it's pretty big. Now, how this changes is if I go into my multi-device preview mode, which is up on the top in primary navigation, let's say that I drop this down to like a small monitor, a tablet, or mobile. Let's just go to tablet for right now. So you can see here, my paragraph is still going to retain that same design setting that I had of 50 pixels. But if I go back into my global styles and go back into my heading styles for H1, and maybe I'll just drop this down to like 25 pixels or so, you can see that it's going to update for that style itself and for that device itself. You can probably imagine that if I set 50 pixels on an H1 tag for desktop, that's going to look great because in most cases I'm going to be accessing that website from a 1500 pixel wide MacBook monitor or iMac or something like that. But once I scale that down to a handheld device and it's 360 pixels, a 50 pixel text or font in that case is going to just take up probably 3 or 4 lines. It's not going to be very consistent. It's going to really muddy kind of that user experience as well. So that's why we allow you, as you toggle through the different device categories, to actually update whatever your size, whatever your styling of your text is as well. So you can see here with mobile, we still have this set at, for H1, 28 pixels by default, which isn't too bad, but it does take up 2 lines. So we could potentially drop this down to like 20, for instance. It'll still be an H1 tag, but it only takes up 1 line on an iPhone 5S. If you have a 6 Plus or something like that, obviously not much of a concern. But whenever you make these device-specific style changes, it's going to inherit for the entire category. So whenever a mobile device actually accesses my website, that H1 will come in at 20 pixels. And that's really important because as I talk about actually managing content and using that paragraph widget, a lot of people will actually do something like this, where they go back into their desktop and they say, let's say that this was let's say I first put it in there and it was like 26 and it was an H1, right? What a lot of people will end up doing is instead just be like, oh, this needs to be a lot bigger. I'm going to drop it into 72. But the problem there is that, as you can see, it's not going to inherit your heading style. So anytime that you have that paragraph, you're actually going to have to change it every single device that you go to, as opposed to just using the H1 styling within your design tab. So you can be a lot more efficient across all of your pages by using the paragraph module. And then also incorporating those H1, H2, H3, 4, 5, 6, etc. Styles that are all device specific. Most of this will be set up for you during the build process. But if you're somebody that likes to get into the weeds a little bit more, the styles panel, or the design panel, I should say, is a great way to really customize that website and kind of dial it into your specific brand. So that is heading styles. Not going to get too much deeper into that, because we do have 10 minutes left. The next thing I'm going to talk about is really cool, and that's button styles. And to do this, I'm going to actually jump back to my home page. We'll cancel out those changes. And buttons are, in terms of call to action, probably one of the most important things on your website outside of things like incentives and inventory, because we want to make sure that we have the right call to action in the right place for the right person, right? So as you can see here on the home page, we just have a general container with a traverse in the background. And then we have a simple call to action for search new, search used, and schedule service. If I click into this module, this is where I can actually select what type of button I want to display. So if I click into search new, for instance, you can see at the bottom here that I actually have selected my secondary style button. I can toggle this back and forth between secondary and primary. And if you look on the left-hand side of your screen there, right in the middle where it says search new, as I toggle, this will actually be updated in real time. So you're probably wondering, where do those settings come from, right? Where do I set those primary and secondary button styles? Well, in that case, you go to the buttons section of your global styles, click into button styles, and here's where all of those settings and criteria exist. So here's all your settings that currently exist for your primary buttons. Here's all your settings that exist for your secondary buttons. The same multi-device settings and configuration apply here as well. Anywhere you see this little multi-device lock icon, that's going to allow you to overwrite any style-specific changes per device. So we'll give you some examples of how that works. For instance, if I take this down to my mobile breakpoint, you can see here that the buttons actually look pretty good. They're stacked vertically, and they're actually pretty big, for a consumer to actually use, which is great, what we want to see on a handheld device. But if I go to my primary button, for instance, and I actually want the font weight to be a little bit bolder, I can simply enough just update that. So schedule service gets kind of a bold typeface in this case. So kind of a text decoration, we'll just drop that back to bold. And you can see it toggles back and forth. The same thing goes for your font style. If I want to do it italicize a specific call to action, and again, this is all multi-device specific, so this will only take place on your mobile devices themselves. And probably the biggest thing in this case is the things like the font color, as well as the actual size of font that you want to use as well. So for instance, things like your button sizes, if I wanted to increase the button size here, on mobile, this is probably a little bit too big. You can see it's actually blasting outside of a container here. So we could probably dial that back, 15 pixels or so. And we have a nice layout, vertical layout of calls to action there. The one thing to mention as well is, you kind of usually see this, I use this sliding scale to kind of make these micro adjustments. But if you want to be a little bit more efficient at this, these are all entry fields as well. So I can simply enough just type in a number and it'll automatically update for me there. That's actually probably where we want to be, just in terms of, kind of the, what do they call it, the fat finger or the fat thumb problem that some people have, where they'll tap on a specific button and it'll actually hit 2. So making it a little bit bigger, a little bit more usable in terms of UI on the actual handheld device kind of makes this whole thing a little bit more efficient. This also talks about button design itself. So for instance, if I go into button styles, and let's say, for instance, I wanted the background color to be a little bit different, I could update that using my hex value. I can also add a little bit of an edge or a little bit of a rounded radius to my buttons as well. So if I go into button styles, and let's say under my primary button, I actually want there to be a little bit of a radius. You can see right now there's 0 pixels, so more of like a rounded edge. I can actually make that about 50 pixels, and it'll make this device-specific style of a rounded button. And that'll only, again, show on your mobile devices. So if you work with an OEM where on the Tier 1 website, they actually require rounded buttons, that's just a simple adjustment that either you or we can make on your behalf. So it just really depends. But a lot of different flexible options that you can use to kind of create a little bit more distinction between your variable ops as well as your fixed ops. Some people will put in, an additional call to action here, which is fine, maybe like a finance form. We won't get too deep into best practices today, but this basically just allows you to create a little bit more, like I said, distinction between what you're actually trying to link customers to or direct them to in terms of navigation. A couple more things that we'll talk about, things like forms. We won't get too deep into this because we only have about 5 minutes left. But things like your input values as well as your field labels. If I were to go to a page, and I think I have one actually here on the home page, let me just jump back to the desktop here. And as you can see, my schedule service button is back to square here. So it did not take on that same style that I had set for mobile. Let me go to a page here. Let's just go to a pop-up page with a form. We'll go to schedule test drive. Here we go. So for a form, actually, let's use the coupon pop-up. Let's go ahead and drag a form onto this page. We'll go into we'll go into forms, and let's just grab a contact us form, and we'll drop it at the bottom here. So when I'm making device-specific changes on my form from Global Styles, just clicking into the form category allows you to edit basically all of the makeup of your form. So like I said before, if there's specific input that you want to edit, as well as field labels or help text, that also goes with things like placeholders and form validation. So if you have some sort of error that you want to throw and you want that to be styled a very specific way, you can do that as well. So let me jump back to the home page here, and I'll just cancel out those changes. So a quick debrief in terms of styles using on the Engine 6 website. Again, we're going to access that from the Design tab, which is at the very top of your primary navigation. And then in terms of everyday site management, probably the things you're going to get the most use out of are your colors, your text, your headings, and your buttons. That's going to change the actual makeup or that underlying architecture of your website just enough to get it dialed into whatever your digital presence denotes. Colors especially, because you can use those hex values if you have, like I said, some sort of marketing or brand guidelines that have to have very specific colors usage in both primary and secondary elements. So again, probably the best way to go about this is go ahead and jump into your design tab if you have access to it. Again, if you're in an OEM program that has more restrictions on compliance, you might not have access to this. If you have questions on it, you can obviously ask us or just reach out to your website account manager. But in terms of colors, text, headings, and buttons, you can make all those updates without actually publishing them to the website. Just refresh your browser. And one thing that I'll mention is we do have page versioning coming out very soon, which will allow you to make these updates and then also kind of do an undo redos type fashion. Like you can see up here, we've already pushed some of the updates live. So similar to what you would see with like a Google Doc or just a general browser, the ability to undo specific changes that you've made within Global Styles. So that's it for today's session. I'm going to jump back to our deck here. And I know I only have about 3 minutes left, but I'm going to just open it up for any questions that you might have. So I'll pause here for just a second. Okay, so one of the questions that came through is based on action buttons. Will SRP buttons inherit those same global styles? Absolutely, they will. I'm just going to jump back into the builder here, and we'll go to like a new inventory SRP, or you might know of it as a VLP. So the idea here is that if I click into my inventory listing module, one of the things that I can do, we'll just open up, let me reload here. When we open up our inventory listing module itself, I'll have to back up here, but when we open up the inventory listing module itself, you have the ability to actually edit your calls to action, your action buttons. And within that, you can select those same toggles for primary and secondary buttons. So if you want a save button that has a different background with a different hover, you can certainly do that. If you want a share button for your social media, for instance, that is a little bit different than that, it's also possible. Good question. Okay, we are just at about time here, so no other questions coming in. That is good. If you have anything that you want to ask after the session's over, I put an email address in here, e6@dealersocket.com. You can feel free to reach out to that. That goes actually directly to myself and the product team. If you have any specific questions about your website, you can also reach out to the website account management team. The last thing that I will bring up is obviously after every session, we want to make sure that you're getting the information that you need during the actual tutorial. So I'm going to launch a poll here that basically just asks you a question in terms of satisfaction. It's completely anonymous. We just like to know exactly what you're getting out of this and if we should continue doing them. And in addition to that, if you do email at e6@dealersocket.com, you can definitely make requests for further sessions as well. So if you want a specific deep dive on SEO management, if you want to get a little bit more into creating inventory pages or segmentation, we can certainly do that. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll, and just feel free to update it at your leisure. Okay, I'll give about 10 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. I will not share the results, but everything was very positive, which is great. So just leave everyone with a quick thank you. Looking forward to our January sessions after everyone comes back from the holiday here. And one thing of note, if you're headed out to NADA in San Francisco on January 23rd, Dealer Socket will be out there. We'll be featuring Engine 6. We hope you drop by the booth, whether you're using the system or you're considering using it. Definitely would like to talk to you about it there. I'll be out there personally, so you can definitely catch up with me and give me any feedback that you might have on these training sessions or the product in general. So thanks everyone for jumping on today. Have a great holiday, and we'll see you after the new year.